A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects, Chapter 10, The Age of Revolution. It is a time of great change in the role-playing game industry. What time? We're talking about the noughties now, the 2000s. And there are two great, enormous, whopping changes to happen to the industry in that decade that still resonate essentially over a decade later in 2020 as it is now. The first of those, and represented by sort of object 81 in our list of 101 objects. Well, it's not actually a physical, tangible object. Object 81 is a website. It's the website drivethrurpg.com, which sells role-playing games in PDF format that you can download. And what a change that's been for the industry. The first website to do this, I think, was RPG Now, founded in 2001, which was mostly, I think naturally for what was big at the time, was mostly D20 products. And was part of that big D20 boom. Not all D20 publishers were putting stuff out only in paper. A lot of them were doing paper and PDF copies, and a lot of companies and small, micro publishers were producing D20 material purely in electronic format, purely as PDFs. And a lot of people made, a nice little earner on the side, and some people did really well out of it. DriveThruRPG came along in, 2004, and was something of a competitor to RPG Now, and in the end seemed like RPG Now became rather more indie focused, and DriveThruRPG became rather more selling the PDF format versions of rather more commercial products. The two merged in, 2006, I think. They merged in accounting terms, but the sites were kept separate for a few years. They're now merged into DriveThruRPG. If you go to rpgnow.com, you will essentially get redirected to DriveThruRPG. So essentially, all your role-playing PDF needs are catered for by DriveThruRPG.com, and it's an excellent website. You might expect me to think of them as a horrible competitor competing against a reseller of classic role-playing games second-hand in print format, but I think there's a place for both companies like DriveThruRPG.com selling PDFs and shops like the shop on the Borderlands to coexist. And I'll be honest, I use DriveThruRPG myself a lot. I quite like to scribble notes on supplements I'm using, on adventures that I'm running, and so I tend to buy the PDF. Even if I've got a nice shiny hardback sitting on the shelf, I like to have the hardback as well, but I often buy the PDF as well. And DriveThruRPG.com has been fantastic, and it certainly has changed the industry, not just in people being able to carry large quantities of role-playing books around electronically instead of having to carry a big bag of books, which is clearly useful for a lot of people, but also because publishing to PDF is much lower cost than publishing to paper. The barriers to entry for small indie publishers are massively reduced if you publish through DriveThruRPG.com. You're still paying the website owner a percentage of your sales, certainly, and some people will think that's not for them. Some people will want to have a physical product and will feel that their role-playing game hasn't really made it until it's a physical product that you can buy in a shop. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and if you're a role-player and you've never really checked out DriveThruRPG.com, I recommend you do. So that was Object 81. That's even though it wasn't really an object, DriveThruRPG.com. Now, our next few objects are all related to the second big innovation of the noughties, which launched in 2009. Can you guess what that is? It's Kickstarter. Kickstarter has fundamentally changed the way that role-playing games can be financed. Certainly not all role-playing games are financed through Kickstarter, but a lot are, and there are a lot of role-playing games around right now in 2020 that would not exist were it not for crowdfunding via Kickstarter. There are other crowdfunding platforms. The role-playing game industry seems to have essentially latched onto Kickstarter as the crowdfunding platform of choice. Losing my voice here a little bit. Now, what kind of games succeed in their Kickstarter projects, Kickstarter funding? Because certainly not all do. And there have been fairly high-profile failures, but for the most part, the failures are the ones that aren't high-profile. So how do you get to be high-profile in Kickstarter? Kickstarter will, recommend projects that are being funded to Kickstarter users. So, if you get known, that helps you a lot. So how do you get known? How do you attract not just the wider public, but the people who run Kickstarter? Well, one way is if you're a famous name designer already. So that takes us to Object 82, which is one of the first games to be very successfully funded on Kickstarter to a large extent. And that's Numenera. Now, this isn't the original version, this is the later version, which I think was also Kickstarter. A beautiful role-playing game. Oops, I've just dropped a bookmark on the floor, just a moment. Don't want to lose the bookmark. Now, what helped Numenera, which is a bit left field, a slightly weird setting. Incidentally, these two beautiful hardbacks in the slipcase. What helped it succeed initially was the designer. There were some famous designers, in particular Monty Cook, and it was Monty Cook's company that published it. Now, Monty Cook, and you also recognise Bruce Cordell and Sean Reynolds, both famous designers, but Monty Cook in particular was one of the co-creators of 3rd edition. And he'd also been quite influential in a lot of the adventures for 3rd edition and for later 2nd edition. He didn't create the Planescape setting, but he was quite significantly involved in it and some of the later adventures for it. And Numenera, although it's certainly not Planescape, appealed to the kind of people who liked Planescape, I think. So the fact that Monty Cook, an established, famous game designer, could go to Kickstarter and could tell people, this is my new game, this is Monty Cook's new game, that really helped. So one easy way to get funding on Kickstarter is to be a famous game designer in the first place. I think possibly some people, don't like that, and they feel that famous designers should leave it for the people who are undiscovered. But I think that's naive, to be honest. And I think something like Numenera possibly might have struggled to find funding with a mainstream publisher because it's a slightly weird setting. In fact, it's been very, very successful and it's one of the biggest role-playing game Kickstarters of all time. That noise is me putting the books back into the slipcase. Big, heavy books. So that's Numenera. I'll show you that. Isn't that lovely? Really, really nice thing. I'll come back to Monty Cook games shortly. Object 83 was another early huge success of Kickstarter, and not necessarily a famous, not mega famous game designer, but was an example of a game where it was a new addition to an established role-playing game that was never a huge seller, but which had an established hardcore audience that wanted more and wanted a new edition and was prepared to back it. And the advantage of Kickstarter, if you go past your funding goals, you can make the product better and better. So this is 7th Sea. This is the 7th Sea 2nd edition core rulebook. And 7th Sea is it's a fantasy role-playing game. It's rather later in its, I suppose, its technology level, its time equivalent than your standard D&D kind of medieval fantasy. It's all early modern, late Renaissance kind of setting. People fight with rapiers, not two-handed battle axes or whatever. And this was a hugely successful and popular Kickstarter. one microphone. Hopefully you can pick that up. So that's the second way to do well with Kickstarter, is to be essentially a new edition of an established game that doesn't have to be popular, but has to have a core following that will spend money. The very, very first Kickstarter I backed personally, way before the Shop of the Borderlands existed, was Traveller 5, and that would fall into that category of a new addition to a role-playing game with a core following of people. Okay, that was object number 83. Object number 84 is, I think this was kickstarted. Again, if you've got an established IP, that's a way to get noticed. So this is Modiphius's Conan RPG. Lots of Conan fans out there. People want a Conan RPG, and if you do well with your funding, you can get, you can make the rule book be nice and colourful with fabulous art. I really do like this piece of artwork. Now, if you compare that to the Mongoose Conan RPG, which is probably the previous role-playing game based on Robert E. Howard's Conan, that's for the most part mostly monochrome art. The art is much less good quality than that. The books are cheaper paper, not as glossy. It's a nicer product, and I think a big part of that is because printing costs, I think, have reduced over the years. But a big part of it is simply because if you've got a Kickstarter wodge of cash, you know how much money you've got to spend on. You don't have to take risks. Now that's the big appeal of Kickstarter for role-playing game publishers, is essentially because everything is funded up front, it takes the risk away. You don't have to gamble your company. And that's why people love Kickstarter. So that's Object 84. Object 85 I don't have to hand, so I have to do with this photograph. This is an example of this is an extreme example, if you like, of what Kickstarter allows you to do because of that funding in advance model. Again, from Monty Cook Games, this is a role-playing game called Invisible Sun. And essentially the core set of this was called the Black Cube because it came in an enormous black cube. We don't have this in stock at the moment. We have stocked it because we backed the Kickstarter. And the Black Cube, you got tons of stuff: rule books, props, a weird hand thing, coins, all sorts of stuff. Very much a luxury role-playing game. Now, there's no way without Kickstarter, there's no way with a conventional funding model that any company, other than perhaps a giant company that was prepared to lose money, there's no way that any company would have produced something like Invisible Sun. Now, Monty Cook Games, the publishers, not a giant publisher by any means, but because of the Kickstarter funding in advance model, they knew they had the money to do it. So they can just go ahead and do it. And it's a really good model. And there's no question we wouldn't have Invisible Sun were it not for Kickstarter. So that's Object 95, Invisible Sun, the Black Cube. And finally, Object 86 in this chapter. This is Tales from the Loop. I don't actually have Tales from the Loop in stock, which we just sold out, I think, literally this week, coming in again soon. This is the sequel, Things from the Flood, which actually, again, we backed this Kickstarter. The reason we as retailers back the Kickstarter is sometimes you get a better deal. Usually it's because you get extra stuff with the Kickstarter that you won't get normally as a retailer, and quite often you get it quite a bit in advance of normal retail channels. So we got Things in the Flood, I think probably 1 and 2 months before anybody else did it, or anybody else who hadn't backed the Kickstarter, which is nice. Things from the Flood is the sequel to Tales from the Loop. Tales from the Loop, again, this is probably a role-playing game that would not have got mainstream funding, or if it did, it would have been an obscure indie title, I imagine. It's a role-playing game where you play Swedish children in the 1980s, and there are weird things going on, and it sounds cool, but it probably also doesn't sound mainstream if you're the kind of person at a publisher whose job it is to decide whether you're going to back this, obscure new role-playing game. But it had a a hook to hang on, which was the art of Simon Stalenhag. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Swedish fans. Who's the Swedish artist who produced this setting. And so, because it looked great, it started to get attention on Kickstarter, and people started to back it. As it came out, as it happens, the role-playing game has been very, very successful. It was probably our best-selling role-playing game in the year that it came out. And when did it come out? 2 years ago now? Yeah, it might have been 2018, 2017. One of those years. It was our best-selling title. Been hugely successful. In fact, so successful that it's going to be a television series on Amazon. Now, how many role-playing games have ever been turned into TV series? Dungeons and Dragons. You know, the cartoon. I think that might be it. So that's quite cool. And I don't think it would have happened without the Kickstarter. And okay, the art already existed, but with all due respect to Simon Stalenhag, what's made his art, I think, most famous in the geek community, the sort of people who are going to watch the TV series, has been the role-playing game. I think it sort of got a bit lucky, and it sort of came in on a sort of Stranger Things wave. You know, it's kids in the 80s, so it sort of fits in with that kind of vibe. And you know, it does feature an American setting as well, but I prefer to think of it as Swedish. Some of the best of Stalenhag's art has got, you know, Volvos and Saabs in the background, with a giant robot walking past or whatever. So that was Object 86, Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood. And I think that's the end of that chapter. That was the Age of Revolution. In the next chapter, we'll be looking at probably the biggest change since then, and that's simply the release of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So I'll see you next time.